What you'll hear on Patreon.
Even if, 100% of Ukrainians wanted to fight Russia till the last Ukrainian, which we know not to be true, even if, right from day one, the Ukrainian government had been opposed to any diplomatic settlement, which we know would be false, and had simply pushed for a, pure, military only solution right from day one. That doesn't mean that European countries, especially, have an obligation to support Ukraine in this suicidal mission, especially insofar as it exposes all of Europe to the very real risk of a direct NATO Russia conflict, which could, of course, escalate into an all out nuclear conflict. My name is Thomas Fazi. I'm a translator, writer, and journalist based in Rome, Italy. My main focus has, for a long time, was economics and European integration, mostly. Clearly, during the pandemic, I focused a lot on that and ended up writing a book about that too, which is called the COVID Consensus. My previous two books were called The Battle for Europe, which largely focused on the Euro crisis, and Reclaiming the State, which was kind of an attempt to make a sort of a progressive case for sovereignty, for national sovereignty. And these days, I mostly write for UnHerd, which is a British magazine, and Compact, which is an American magazine. And I write about a wide variety of topics these days, anything from geopolitics to economics. Again, I write a lot about Europe. Obviously, write quite a lot about Italy, since it's where I live. I've written a lot about Ukraine. Sadly, for the past 18 months. And yeah, that's pretty much it, I guess.
The first thing that I wanted to really talk to you about was your writing about Ukraine. And I feel like I have a certain affinity with your writing because correct me if I'm wrong, but I detect a strong suspicion towards elites or those in power. And I share this, like I was immediately skeptical of this rhetoric of, well, this is a war about democracy and freedom. And I was like, you don't care about democracy and freedom. We just saw that coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, you don't really care about saving lives because we went from even one death is too many to, yeah, let's just send a whole bunch of young men to the front. So it struck me immediately that a little bit more, you couldn't just accept the rhetoric for what it was. As this has was Did you start out being kind of skeptical of some of the dominant narratives, or did it take you a while to
I
kind
mean,
of begin to think more critically about what is underpinning and driving this war?
well, I mean, first of all, let me say that I'm surprised that anyone, believes is ready to believe the narrative about, from the coming from the U.S. government and Western authorities more in general, concerning any war. I mean, we know that they have, systematically, repeatedly lied in the past to start and justify these wars. The war in Iraq being the most obvious example. But there are, many more examples. And so the idea, we know, I mean, not everyone, of course, but I mean, I was especially surprised by people who, in the past have criticized U.S. foreign policy. In the past, criticized the U.S. post 9/11 wars, and in general have been critical of kind of U.S. Imperialistic and neo-colonial policies um, over the years and even decades. Um, Suddenly thinking that somehow what's happening, or the U.S. behavior in Ukraine, somehow different from, all the previous wars and, foreign interventions and actions that they've done. Suddenly, for the first time ever, when it comes to this war, they're telling the truth, and they're motivated solely by um, a desire to uphold democracy and sovereignty and protect the Ukrainian people. So, I'm not shocked by people who have always been supporters of, you know, um, US empire, or people who have always believed the mainstream narrative about these wars, believing the current narrative over Ukraine, that fits the pattern. What I'm surprised is that, people that historically have been very skeptical of official narratives completely buying into the narrative when it comes to Ukraine. But of course, you could say the same about what happened during the pandemic, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that too. So that just kind of as a general note. So yes, of course, even if I hadn't known anything about Ukraine until February 2022, I still would have been kind of instinctively suspicious of the official narrative, because I know that people in power, and especially people in power within the American government, have a tendency to lie, especially when it comes to foreign policy. So I would have been naturally skeptical, and I would have, been driven to kind of look at whether the narrative corresponded to reality or not. But in fact, when I did know about Ukraine, uh, unlike like a lot of people, I would say, in Western countries who likely had never really thought about Ukraine that much before February 2022. Um, I've been following what was happening in Ukraine for the past, uh, well, now 8 years, almost 9 years. By that, I mean that, in fact, there was a war going on in Ukraine even before 2022. In fact, there's been a brutal, bloody civil war been going on in Ukraine since 2014. And I also followed the events that preceded the start of the civil war in 2014. And I'm talking about the um, violent regime change. Some call it a coup, some call it an overthrow. It definitely was an unconstitutional regime change, whereby the democratically elected government, the democratically elected president Yanukovych, was removed um, in a U.S. backed um, series of actions, which culminated in very violent clashes with between protesters and Ukrainian security forces. And that's what triggered the war. And so, of course, when I started hearing, out of that, oh, a war has broken out in Ukraine now that Russia has invaded, that immediately sent, alarm bells ringing, because that in itself was a lie. And so, and that was just the first of many, many lies that have been told about this war since day one.
So tell me a bit more about that lie.
The main lie, as I was saying, was that the war started in 2022. The war started in 2014. So Russia's invasion in 2022 is simply an escalation of a war that was already going on, a war that was already a proxy war, because it was a war, a civil war that was kind of initially triggered by the United States meddling in Ukrainian affairs, supporting protesters and even violent armed protesters that ended up overthrowing the democratically elected government of Ukraine. So, that in itself tells you that that even way before 2022, this was about much more than just Russia versus Ukraine. This was already a much wider conflict involving a variety of actors. First and foremost, the United States, but also EU countries and the European Union as an institution. and of course NATO, because what happened after the overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014 was, of course, the installation of a pro-Western, um, you could say, puppet government, because we know that the prime minister and other key members of government were kind of handpicked by then Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the then American ambassador to Ukraine. We know this because a phone conversation between the two was then leaked, where they were discussing, who should, go and form the new Ukrainian government. So clearly, the U.S. was directly and heavily involved in what happened in the events prior to the overthrow of the government and the events that followed that, including the selection of the um, of the new government. And
So they lied to kind of create this narrative of this sort of clean slate, that this was something totally new, no
yeah,
connections to
of
the
course. I
past.
mean, and of course, it doesn't end there. We know that from 2014 to 2022, a lot happened in Ukraine, which also explains Russia's decision to invade. I mean, it's important to understand because another big lie, which of course relates to the first lie, is that this was a completely irrational act by an essentially crazy dictator driven by um, a purely imperialistic, chauvinistic drive, which some say is even kind of intrinsic to the nature of the Russian state. But fundamentally, that this was a completely unprovoked invasion. Uh, in fact, you hardly ever hear any Western or official authority talk about the invasion without the prefix unprovoked. In fact, it's almost part of a generalized Western-wide, propaganda campaign that you can't mention the invasion without adding the prefix unprovoked. In fact, it was. It was unprovoked. Of course, that's a big part of the Western narrative, the Western lie, because if this was the action of a madman driven solely by his hatred for Ukrainians and desire to conquer as much territory as possible, i.e., a new Hitler, as he is often described in the Western media and even by Western officials, then of course there is no solution but a uh, complete military victory uh, by Ukraine and the West and NATO, because of course the implication of their argument is that he will never stop. Once he conquers Ukraine, he will just keep moving on into arguably west, moving west towards towards the other European countries until he's conquered the entire continent. Now, this is absolutely ludicrous, but of course, it's central to the Western strategy, because that is what justifies the Western strategy. That is what justifies not attempting to reach any diplomatic solution. Because if Putin is a crazy madman, he can't be reasoned with. So it's important to understand the origins of the invasion. It's important to understand that it's an act that may be immoral. In fact, is immoral. I would argue, as all wars are, but is not irrational. In fact, is rational from the perspective of any state's natural propension, I would say, and even their duty to their own citizens to ensure the integrity and survival of their own states. I think this is what we're talking about here. And so we know that between 2014 and 2022, a lot happened. We saw increased logistical, financial, and military support by NATO to Ukraine. We saw Ukraine being de facto integrated into NATO. We know there's a big debate about whether Ukraine should be integrated into NATO or not. Uh, but that debate completely misses the point, because being integrated in NATO is not about it's also about, of course, the formal alliance and the other country's obligation to defend that country in case of attack, et cetera, even though there are caveats to that too. So, but in fact, when NATO is militarily, logistically, financially supporting the military of another country, in this case, Ukraine, when it's working towards what they call interoperability between the Ukrainian military and NATO's military, what you have is a de facto integration of Ukraine into the NATO structure. We even saw in 2021 NATO being invited to participate in a massive naval exercise that was held by NATO in the Black Sea, which saw the participation of 33 countries plus Ukraine. So when you're even being invited to officially participate in war games by NATO, you can arguably say that you're effectively becoming part of NATO, and that's something that Russia had repeatedly made clear over the years it would never accept. For a number of reasons. First and foremost, the fact that Russia shares about 1,500 kilometers of border with Ukraine. So really, it's perfectly you know reasonable for Russia not to want Ukraine to be integrated de facto into NATO, which is what was happening. And on top of that, you've got a whole series of escalatory actions by NATO. You've got live fire um, um, exercises being conducted by NATO in Estonia. You've got the U.S. withdrawing from a number of security agreements with Russia um, over the years, but up until 2021. And so there was a constant escalation by NATO, and again, I just want to stress the fact that, of course, this was kind of the final stage of a, you could say, 20-year long provocation by NATO against Russia. And I'm, of course, talking about NATO's complete disregard of the assurances and promises that were given to Russia in the early 90s that NATO would not expand to the east. Of course, we know the opposite happened. And by the mid 2000s, essentially virtually all of the former countries of the Warsaw Pact had been integrated into NATO. And Russia hadn't, reacted to any of that. I think NATO did that at the time simply because it knew it could. It knew Russia was too weak to react, and so it just decided that it would, continue expanding in a way that would justify NATO's existence. Kind of a self-fulfilling rationale for NATO, but it would also put pressure on Russia. America has always been afraid of Russia. Russia being this massive country. It's always, dreamt, or at least sections of the U.S. establishment have always dreamt of breaking up Russia. And so I think they just thought, well, that was an act of hubris. It was just like, we're going to keep expanding and circling Russia because there's nothing they can do about it. I don't think they were inviting a Russian reaction. I mean, they weren't deliberately inviting a Russian reaction. They simply thought Russia wouldn't react. I think that changes at some point. I think we reach a point where, and you see that very clearly, and with the Ukraine affair, I think at some point the US changes strategy, and the strategy becomes that of deliberately provoking Russia. I would say in hope of provoking an invasion. I think it was quite clear to US officials that this war would have been very beneficial to US interests, at least in the short term, and that in fact has turned out to be very much true, and we can discuss that further. And so I would say that not only has the war been provoked by the US and NATO, I would say that even worse, it has been deliberately provoked in order for the US to pursue, its wider geostrategic goals in the Eurasian region.
So I do want to come back to that, specifically what interests are at play here. But what do you think of the argument that I'm sure gets thrown at you all the time, which is what you're saying is, her skirt was too short. That just because these things happen doesn't necessarily mean that Russia was sort of forced to react.
Well, I don't take a moral stance on these issues. I would say ultimately it depends what's our goal. Is our goal to prevent um, as many rapes and or invasions as possible, or is it to simply make a political argument? If our aim is to prevent as many rapes as possible, of course, enforcement, education, cultural change is all very important. But at the same time, I would say that not walking into a party full of drunken testosterone filled adolescents wearing a bikini is probably not a good idea, in the sense that that testosterone filled male is very much likely to do something bad to you. So my advice to my daughter, when she reaches that age, would be, don't put yourself in a dangerous situation, because there are situations where men will do bad things to women, and of course, that's not a justification; it's simply a fact. In the same, by the same token, I would say it's a fact that states, um, states have some kind of instinctual obligations to their own people, to themselves. States are fairly rational actors, I would say. I agree with John Mearsheimer, the famous international relations theorist from America, who makes a very similar case. It's important to understand how states work, how they act, if we want to achieve the aim of the greatest degree of peace possible. And we know that, for most states, I would say for most sovereign states, not all states are sovereign, and especially for kind of major powers, um, ensuring their own survival and staving off any threat to their survival and integrity is just an instinct they have. It doesn't mean that what that 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 drives them to do is right or moral. It's just a fact. So we know that if Canada or Mexico entered a military alliance with Russia or China, or even went as far as installing offensive weapons systems on their territories, America would react very badly. We remember what happened the last time a few missiles were deployed near the American border in Cuba. The world almost ended, and that almost drove America and the USSR to a nuclear conflict. So that's just how states, and especially major states, um, react. And I think we know that that's how states react. And that's why over the years, for example, NATO and America and Russia have drawn up all these security arrangements, all these security um, um, agreements, whereby they decided, not to engage in offensive action against each other, not to deploy long range ballistic or even less so nuclear missiles near their respective borders, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that states, that if we want to ensure that states, or if we want to diminish the risk that states act violently, we have to take the legitimate security concerns of those states into consideration. And so again, this isn't something that happened out of the blue. As far back as the late 1990s, you've got among the foremost U.S. diplomats of the 20th century, from George Kennan, who was at one time the U.S. ambassador to um, the Soviet Union under Stalin, to a number of other officials. But as far back as the late 90s, Kennan told the New York Times, and that was the very early stages of NATO expansion, and he was already saying, "Look, this is a threatening action against threatening behavior against Russia. And if we continue down this path, this is going to invite a reaction from Russia at some point." Um, so, the fact that if you've got countless high level, certainly not pro Russian US officials over the years and indeed decades saying, if we do X, Russia is going to react with Y. And the US keeps doing X, and we end up with Russia doing Y. Uh, you know, again, it's not a moral justification for what Russia did, but I think it does show that this was amply predictable, and it could have been avoided. Um, I would say, and I think this is a crucial point. I think, and that is that I don't think Russia wanted to go down this path. I think it tried up until the last minute to avoid this war. We've got I would, in hindsight, an almost heartbreaking letter that the Russian ambassador to the US wrote in December 2021, so just a few months before the invasion, where the Russian ambassador says to his counterparts in the US, "Look, the situation is very, very serious. Can we please get back at the table, at the diplomatic table, and can we please start drawing up, really start sketching an architecture? Can we start, maybe could the US maybe consider re-entering a whole series of security agreements that it had walked out of in the previous years?" And it makes concrete proposals to the US in terms of, and it never says so openly, but it's quite clear within, between the lines, that the Russia is saying, this time we're not going to back down. So Russia is essentially telling the US, look, we are willing to sit down and move towards a de-escalation of the situation. But if you guys are not willing to de-escalate, this is what will happen. It's a very, very explicit letter. It's a letter that's completely disregarded and ignored by U.S. officials, and in fact, we keep witnessing, inflaming escalatory remarks by U.S. officials and even by Zelensky, who keeps repeating that Ukraine will join NATO at some point in the future, and stuff like that. And so there's a constant escalation, which results in what we know to have happened in February 2022. And
Of course,
so,
what they would say is that actually this is, Russian manifest destiny at work here, that it's a totally separate trajectory than the American or NATO escalation.
well, I mean, I'd like to see proof of that. I think there's nothing that shows an intrinsic kind of imperialistic expansionary drive in post Cold War Russian foreign policy. I really don't see where that drive is. I see an expansionary drive by NATO towards Russia's borders. So I'd like to see, the evidence for that. I think, the writings of, or obscure Russian intellectuals, or even some declarations that may have been made by certain Russian officials over the years is not really enough to make a case that, this is something that Russia was going to do, regardless of what the US or NATO had ever done. I think there's a much stronger case that points towards the fact that this is a clear reaction to war against NATO policy. I mean, there's really very little evidence that this, is part of something that's kind of intrinsic to the kind of great Russia ideology. You know, I I I find that to be an easy excuse, because that essentially lets NATO and the West off the hook for everything. It means that we have no responsibility whatsoever, because they would have done this um, anyway. So I find that quite a spurious argument, to be honest. Um, you know, again, this would imply that on Russia's behalf, um, the objective is simply to keep on pushing and pushing and pushing until they've conquered all of Ukraine, and then to keep on pushing south, east, west, north. Well, maybe not north, definitely west. Um, and and in fact, even that is disproven by the fact that we now, well, it was clear, it's been clear throughout the months, but now we have more evidence of the fact that there have been various attempts at diplomatic engagement between Russia and Ukraine since the start of this war. So again, on one hand, we keep hearing in Western mainstream media, we're the good guys, we're the rational guys, we're the ones that have the interest of Ukraine at heart. You know, Putin is a crazy guy who can't be reasoned with. That flies in the face of the fact that, in fact, there have been many diplomatic talks between Russian officials, Russian authorities, and Ukrainian authorities. The first one's beginning a few days after the invasion. Um, then we have another set of talks around March. These are brokered by the former Israeli Prime Minister, um, who um, who said that Russia and Ukraine were quite close to reaching a deal on that occasion. And then in April, again, we have another attempt at reaching a diplomatic agreement, this time brokered by Turkey. And in all three cases, what we hear from people directly involved in the negotiations, i.e., this former Israeli prime minister, whose name I can't remember now, and the Turkish officials that were involved in the negotiations, they say at some point, you know, even even once we'd reached quite high level stages of the negotiation, where there was a broad agreement, a general broad agreement about a possible diplomatic solution to end, at least for a ceasefire, uh, US or UK officials, essentially stormed the negotiations and told the Ukrainians that they mustn't negotiate with Russia. And we have very authoritative people saying this. We have, this former Israeli prime minister saying it. We have the Turkish officials which are involved in the negotiations saying it. With that, they always tell the same story. There was a broad agreement between the two sides, and then the US or the UK stormed in and essentially blocked the negotiations. So who's the irrational one? Who's the one pushing for war? I think we would do very well to take a long, hard look in a mirror, and talked about the West as a whole. Often the charges that we lay against others, reflect much more our own behavior than that of our enemies. I think what this shows is that if there is make the principal actor that has sabotaged every possible negotiation, that has pushed for a constant escalation of the war here, it's not Russia, it's the US and NATO.
You took part in a debate.
If Russia stops fighting, there's no more war.
Yeah.
If Ukraine stops fighting, there's no more Ukraine.
Of course. But my point is...
But Ukraine could stop fighting tonight and the Americans would continue to keep the war going. This is...
And everyone kind of gasped in the audience. And he walked it back. He was sort of unwilling to commit to that statement. What do you think of that? Would you take it that far?
I think that's what we've seen. I mean, when you have Ukrainian high-level negotiators, high-level government officials coming very close to drafting an agreement with Russia, and in one case, we even had the actual draft of the agreement. Putin showed the document at a recent to a recent delegation of African leaders in St. Petersburg, I think. So we have the actual document, I think, already countersigned by Ukraine. So this is how far Ukraine has gone throughout the war to try to stop this war, just to be stopped each time by Washington. So that in itself, I think, is a confirmation of what Hitchens said. So it's not a hypothetical. This is something that I would say has already happened repeatedly over the course of the past 18 months. And now we start seeing these disgusting, editorials in the U.S. press lamenting the fact that I think one guy, was it David Ignatius, if that's how you pronounce his name, the pro-war hawk who writes for the Washington Post, lamenting the fact that what he said was that, and this relates to America benefiting from this war. He said, yes, it hasn't been turning out too well for Ukraine, but this has been, I think his words were, this has been a marvelous summer for NATO, something along those lines. And he was referring, of course, to the fact that, Finland had entered NATO, Sweden wants to enter NATO. In fact, will enter NATO. And so that says a lot about the US mindset. And we have countless other, editorials and even speeches by U.S. politicians, essentially saying, "Look, I mean, this war is great. We're achieving a series of, we're ach- we're benefiting from this war in many ways at very little cost." And of course, the economic cost, as much as it, you know, uh, uh, may be inflaming when compared to how few resources the US puts elsewhere compared to how much money they put into the Ukraine war. In macro terms, it's not like this is a big expense for the US. They're testing out new weaponry, so it's working out quite well for them. And now,
It's
what?
also in keeping with the way that America has approached wars, where they try to stay out of it as long as possible and supply weapons. So there's, it's
Sure,
not
we've gone. I
out
mean,
of line.
we know that. I mean, America has learned that. Uh, I mean, the U.S. officials have understood that that as a result of the post 9/11 wars, which, cost millions of lives to, people around the world, but also cost thousands of lives of US soldiers, that the American public has become quite, as they say, kind of body bag averse. They don't like to see American soldiers coming back in coffins for obvious reasons. And so, America's learned the lesson, and now, it tries to keep it keeps to do anything, everything in its power to avoid actual boots on the ground when it comes to wars. That doesn't mean that it doesn't wage wars, it doesn't wage aggression against countries. It now resorts to drones, it resorts to proxy armies. By the way, this isn't even the first proxy conflict that America and Russia fight. Even the Syrian conflict was, to a large degree, a proxy war between the US and Russia. Uh, and 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 so what so I think you have all these statements lately, even going as far as lamenting the fact that Ukrainians are becoming. I think one guy said, what was it? Uh, uh, Death averse. It wasn't death averse, but they're becoming averse to dying, basically. And this is why the counteroffensive hasn't played out as everyone hoped, or as everyone pretended it would, or at least in the West. So now they're actually blaming Ukrainians for not fighting with the stamina that the US would like them to fight with. Uh, in the face of what even military experts say are often just suicide missions, just people sent on foot or, even in tanks, but with no air support against Russian artillery, where they just get taken out one by one, bam, 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 bam. And, these are literal suicide missions. And clearly, the US officials, they don't give a damn about all the Ukrainians that have died in this war and that continue to die. I think that seems clear. They have no concern whatsoever for the massive, tragic loss of life in Ukraine. According to official figures, which means the actual number is probably even higher, there have been close to 100,000 Ukrainian deaths up until now. The number is probably even higher. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of the loss, massive loss of life, um, which I would say the US and NATO are to a large degree responsible for, in insofar as they did everything in their power to ensure that this war continued, even in the face of Ukrainian attempts to, find a diplomatic settlement with Russia. And so I think the idea that people in the US and the US establishment care about Ukraine it is absolutely ludicrous. To them, Ukrainians are literally just pawns on a chessboard. Just like the Afghans were in the 80s, and just as countless other proxies that the US has relied on throughout the decades have always been. These are not human beings in their eyes; they're just pawns on a chessboard. And I think and so this also explains the increasing reports that we see from Ukraine about the very high number of Ukrainian men that are trying to leave the country. They don't want to be drafted and sent to die on these suicide missions for a war that cannot be won, which is something that I think a lot of people on the ground in Ukraine understand quite well. these are stories that you won't, generally aren't reported in the mainstream Western media, because we're led to believe that all Ukrainians are gung ho, just super happy to go to the front line and die for their nation. In fact, its picture is quite different. There are a number, there's war fatigue for obvious reasons kicking in Ukraine, and a number of young Ukrainians don't want to go to the front. They don't want to go to the front. They've seen the videos of people just sent completely, with no defense into minefields. They've seen the videos of people just sent, with nothing but their bodies up against Russian artillery just to be taken out, um, you know, one at a time. And so I think, but we never hear about that, and so again, I think we have a very skewed idea, even of the sentiment within Ukraine when it comes, to this war.
Well, they trot out surveys all the time, saying like, I think the most recent one that I saw was something like 84% of Ukrainians are in it for the long haul. They support the war effort. And that's the big justification. It's like the Ukrainians themselves are willing to fight to the last man. There might be some war fatigue, there might be some loss of heart. Sure, that happens all the time in wars. But on the whole, Ukrainians seem to be desperate for intervention. So is it not? I guess it kind of gets framed a lot as like pro-Ukraine, pro-Russia. And if you're not sort of in support of their desperate calls for help, then you're essentially pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine.
Well, again, I mean, this is the whole argument about, it's all about, it's the Ukrainian agency argument, which you always hear, oh, when you talk about a proxy war, you're denying agency to Ukraine. It's Ukraine making the decisions. It's Ukraine devising the policy, devising the strategy. We're simply helping them um, uh, um, accomplish the aims that they have completely independently and autonomously drawn up. And I think, but what we've talked about until now, I think disproves that narrative. We have a number, the idea that the Ukrainians are in charge and that we're simply kind of giving them what they're asking us and helping them, achieve their own strategic aims, which we're not influencing in any way. That's ridiculous. I mean, we know that, and in fact, it's been reported these days, even in the Western press, that NATO, of course, NATO command is actively engaged in drawing up the strategies, in drawing up and devising a military campaign. The idea is that Ukrainians are doing all this by themselves and that there's no Western influence or NATO influence is absolutely ludicrous. And in fact, what we've discussed earlier, I think shows that there have been numerous instances where Ukraine wanted to go in one direction and the US told them to push in the opposite direction. And so I think this denies a good part of the Ukrainian agency argument. Where was the agency? Why wasn't the Ukrainian agency taken into consideration throughout all these attempts to reach a diplomatic agreement? Apparently, no one cared about the Ukrainian agency in that case. So, the Ukrainian agency is only good when it goes in the direction we want the Ukrainians to go. Whenever the Ukrainians, differ in their policy and in their strategy from the U.S. NATO strategy, somehow their agency is not taken into consideration anymore.
Visit patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley for part 2.